Ha-Shoah Memorial Program. And I want to begin by noting that words are woefully inadequate for expressing the horrific reality of the murder of 6 million Jews during the decade 1935 to 1945. The proportions of the hateful, inhuman behavior of the Nazis and their collaborators are impossible to represent verbally. And yet words are the foundational means we have for sharing feelings and thoughts with each other. So we use them even to define the ineffable. The two words I think that we use most commonly when referring to the World War II murder of the Jews are Shoah and Holocaust. These two terms have different but appropriately complementary meanings. The Hebrew term Shoah means a catastrophic, cataclysmic destruction. Holocaust means a complete burning by fire. Both are accurate descriptions of the process that blotted out 1/3 of world Jewry. That process being annihilation, or in German, Vernichtung, a word found often in official Nazi documents. Tonight, we will conclude Yom HaShoah 5781 by remembering the martyrs who perished and expressing gratitude for the survivors who lived. Grief and gratitude, hopelessness and hope, darkness and light, death and rebirth will commingle in our consciousness as we seek faith and comfort in prayer and music. Our beloved Cantor, Hillary Chorny, will now begin our memorial service.
Never say that you're going your last way. Although the sky's filled with lead-covered blue days, our promised hour will soon come. Our marching steps ring out. We are here. This is the first bite, the first stanza of the song Zog nit kein Mol, written by the young Vilna poet Hersh Glick, that was set to a pre-existing melody by the Soviet Jewish composer Dmitry Bokras. I remember where and when I learned this tune. My own cantor growing up in San Diego, Cantor Eliza Pomerantz-Borough, had us on the steps of the sanctuary at Tifereth Israel Synagogue. And we stood and we learned this from Gussie Zaks, who I just learned today is of blessed memory since she passed in 2018. Gussie had been in Treblinka, and before that she was the youngest of 6. And she understood that her parents and most of her 6 siblings had been murdered in the gas chamber. And before that, she had been sent to a work camp. And later, she was among 1,000 women who were marched for 12 weeks through the frigid European winter and then loaded onto boxcars for the ride to the Bergen-Belsen death camp. She told us this story, and it was hard to hear. And then she taught us this song, and it was sweet to learn. And I have never forgotten her, and I have never forgotten this tune. I'll sing the first stanza and another that has stayed with me as well. In her memory, may it continue to be for a blessing. Sag nicht kein Mal, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Kosch himmeln bleib nicht verstellen bläutig. Komm, in weit noch unser Haus gewinnt geschah. Es wird abheugt an unser Schatz mir seinen da. Komm, in weit noch unser Haus gewinnt geschah. Es wird abheugt an unser Schatz mir seinen da. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Sie ist nicht kein Lied von der Feigen auf der Frei. Das hat der Volk zwischen fallen dicke Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit einer ganz in der Hand. Das hat der Volk zwischen fallen dicke Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit einer ganz in the hand. This song is written with blood and not with pencil lead. It's not a tune sung by birds in the wild. The song was sung by people amidst collapsing walls, sung with pistols in their hands. I turn this back to you, Rabbi Rembaum.
Thank you. Nizkor et achenu v'achayotenu. We shall remember our brothers and sisters, the houses of the city and the houses of the country, the streets of the shtetl streaming like rivers, and the lonely inn on the open road, the face of the old man, the mother in her kerchief, the young girl with braids, and the infant. The thousands of communities of Israel amid the families of the earth, all the congregations of Jews who were slaughtered on the soil of Europe by the Nazi murderer. The man who suddenly screamed and while screaming died. The woman who clutched her child to her bosom, but her arms could not hold her. The baby whose fingers explored his mother's nipple, but it was blue and cold. The feet that sought to flee but found no refuge. And those who shaped their hands into a fist, the fist that grasped the iron that became the weapon of vision, despair, and rebellion. And they, the strong of heart, open-eyed, freely offered up their lives, but were unable to bring salvation. We shall remember the day in its brightness, the sun that rose upon the bloody scene, the heavens that stood high and silent. We shall remember the mounds of dust under the blooming gardens. The living shall remember the dead, for they are always before us. Their eyes glancing round and round give us no peace until our lives become worthy of their memory. Written by Abba Kovner. We're now going to invite 6 families to light candles in memory of loved ones, martyrs who were lost, and survivors who live. And we're going to ask them to mention the names of their loved ones. We invite everyone else to please use the chat and include in the chat the names of loved ones whom you will wish to remember this evening. And so we begin. Rachel Reuben Greene.
My mother was a Kindertransport survivor. And I'm lighting tonight in memory of her friend, whose name was Walter Levy. And the story I heard was Walter's mother had 2 children and 1 Kindertransport pass. And Walter did not get it. And I learned from his Stolperstein, his memorial marker, that he was murdered in the Riga ghetto at the age of 15. So this is for Walter Levy.
Thank you, Rachel. Evelyn Steinberg.
Yes, Rabbi, thank you so much. I'm lighting in memory of my whole family, some I never had the privilege to meet. My tati was Menachem Mendelben, Yaakov Yosef Bela, and he was a partisan fighter. And he watched, dug a hole for his family in the forest, not realizing they were going to be marched by him and his remaining brother of 15 kids, and watch his family perish in front of him. And my mother, Alav Shalom, Shane Dalbas, Yitzhak Bachaya, Sonia Bogan, and Max Bogan, had my sister in the DP camps, Bela, Betty Bogan. And so I light in their memory along with my grandparents, who I actually knew, Chaya and Yitzhak. So,
Thank you, Evelyn.
thank you.
Zvi Resnick. Please unmute, Zvi.
I light this candle in memory of my grandfathers, my one grandmother, 5 aunts, 2 uncles, a number of cousins who all perished, either in the Lodz ghetto or the concentration camps that they were shipped to out of the ghetto. And in gratitude for my parents who survived, my uncle Shlomo, my father's brother who survived, and my uncle Aryeh, my mother's brother who survived by having left Poland in 1934 and eventually joining the Haganah in Israel. And in memory of all of those.
Thank you, Zvi. Renee Bainval.
We're lighting this candle and all the relatives that were killed and ones that we were not able to meet.
We are lighting this candle in gratitude of my mother and mother-in-law who survived the camps and are able today to live to a ripe age and be able to have nachas and see not only grandchildren, but great-grandchildren.
Thank you, Renee. Gabe Kramer.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm lighting this candle in memory of the tens of thousands of Latvian Jews, including my grandfather's parents and siblings, that were marched into the forests and shot, depriving future generations like me of ever being able to honor them by placing a stone on a proper grave. Fortunately, my grandfather was able to come to the United States in the 20s, but everyone else that I've learned about beyond him was never to be known again.
Thank you, Gabe.
And Rabbi, I'm going to go ahead and stand in for the last candle lighter. This is Leah Mandelbaum, and I have lit this candle in memory of all my family who were murdered on the beach in Latvia on the Baltic Sea.
Thank you, Leah. And now, if you can stand, please stand. If you have difficulty, remain seated. Cantor Chorny will now chant the Shoah El Malei Rachamim.
Il malei rachamim, shochin b'meromim, hamitzim menucha nechona, tachat kanfei hashchina, b'mahalot kedoshim u'turim. Zohar harakia mashirim lenishmot kol hachenu b'nei שנצמחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם, ענה בעל הרחמים, הסירים בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
Cantor Chorny and I will now recite the Shoah Kaddish. She will recite the Aramaic, and I will include the names of camps and ghettos where our brothers and sisters perished.
Yitgadal
Auschwitz,
v'yitkadash
Lodz,
Shemei Rabbah
Honar,
Be'alma Divra Kirute
Babi Yar,
V'yamlich Malchute
Majdanek,
B'chayechon uvyomechon
Birkenau,
Uvchaye Dechol Beit Yisrael
Kovno,
Ba'agala Ubizman Kariv
Yanovska,
V'imru Amen.
Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevarach Ve'olam Lelnei Maya.
Yitbarach v'yishabach
Theresienstadt,
v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam
Buchenwald,
v'yitnaseh v'yithadar
Treblinka,
v'yitaleh v'yithalal
Vilna,
shemei dekudsha
Bergen-Belsen,
berich hu le'ela
Mauthausen,
min kol birchata v'shirata
Dachau,
tushbechata v'nechamata
Minsk,
da'amiran be'alma
Varsha,
v'imru amen.
Amen. Yehi Shalama Rabba Min Shamaya, V'chayim Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael B'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'imromav, Uyaseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael B'imru Amen. You may be seated. It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce our special guest tonight as we segue from our memorial service into our exposure, listening to, learning about music saved from the flames. Gary Greene is a highly respected trial lawyer and an accomplished violinist and orchestra conductor. He's an alumnus of Fairfax High School, UCLA, and Loyola University Law School, all with highest honors. Beginning in 1963 and for 4 decades thereafter, Mr. Greene was a violinist, concertmaster, and part-time conductor of the Junior Philharmonic Orchestra of California. For more than 25 years, in addition to his law practice, Mr. Greene has served as a temporary judge in Southern California courtrooms, and in 1980, he was admitted to practice before the United States Supreme Court. Most relevant for tonight's program, Gary Greene is the founder-conductor of the Lawyers Philharmonic, its chorus, legal voices, and the award-winning band, Gary Greene Esquire, and his big band of barristers. I like that title. And Gary has made it a personal mission to recover music and musical instruments that were presumed lost in the Holocaust. Hence the title of our program, Saved from the Flames, Jewish Music from the Shoah. Gary Greene, welcome to the Temple Beth Am community.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. And thank you, Cantor, for a very meaningful service. It's an honor for me to be here today. And I would like to take a moment to introduce a piece that was the centerpiece of a program I had planned for a year ago as part of the Violins of Hope project, where we were going to perform on instruments that were recovered from the Holocaust. This central piece is called Schlof Mein Kind. It's a Yiddish lullaby, meaning "Sleep, My Child." And the lyrics were composed in the early part of the 20th century by David Einhorn. The music was composed by a contemporary composer by the name of Alan Naplin. And the work was put together but because of COVID-19, we were unable to do so. So we went ahead and made a virtual recording, and that took us some time because each member had to be recorded individually. You will be hearing 50 members, that is members of my Lawyers Philharmonic and members of our chorus, Legal Voices, in Schlof Mein Kind.
Rabbi, need to unmute yourself.
I was saying thank you very much, Gary. While I was listening to that and watching the pictures of the children, I imagined how many countless numbers of mothers sang that lullaby to their children, only to have their children literally torn out of their arms and separated, never to see them again. And it's very powerful, very powerful. Thank you so much for that. So now I'd like to invite you to share with us what you have found on your mission. What has moved you in the findings of music and instruments and whatever that has to do with a musical legacy that came out of the Shoah and was lost, recovered, and now perhaps music that we can listen to and remember, but also be touched by its beauty. So, Gary, please proceed.
Thank you, Rabbi. One would think that coming out of such a horrible time, where does music fit in? Music in the Holocaust came from two directions. We can understand by seeing the photos that we just saw in this picture that there was music. Matter of fact, there's a composer in Italy by the name of Francesco Lautaro who spent more than 30 years researching and recovering music that was composed in the concentration camps. I understand to date, he has already cataloged more than 8,000 pieces of music. Really incredible. All kinds of music, songs, lullabies, Yiddish songs, symphonies, operas, composed in concentration camps. And it was a very daunting task. It's not easy to, those imprisoned did not have any of the tools that musicians have to compose. Many pieces were written on backs of scraps of papers, of various things that came in, including even toilet paper. Music was written on everything. And this much music was found. It's also known that to save lives, to keep warm, much music had to be burned for the heat purpose. So that much was lost. And the other thing is, how did the music survive and how did it get out? A lot of it had to be memorized and was taken out by survivors who were able to remember it. And there are all kinds of stories how some of the music was able to escape and then given to survivors and their children, and then it's been collected, and that's what this compilation is taking place. But let me take a few minutes to speak about some of the very talented composers whose lives were lost in the Holocaust and who wrote some of the compositions that have recently been recovered. Or as I begin this, I mentioned that there's this composer in Italy. I can come a lot closer to home and talk about music that's being recovered right here in Los Angeles. As a matter of fact, right here in this congregation, Beth Am, because one of the leading people who has financed and promoted this is a significant member of this congregation, Marilyn Siri, has worked with composer James Conlon of the LA Opera and put together a project called Recovered Voices. And there have been performances of this music at the Music Center over the years. So we don't have to go around the world to find who is doing this and who is salvaging some of this music. You have it right here. My compliments to her and to everybody here in the congregation. But to talk about some of the composers, I'll name a few. They're not popular names because their music was basically lost for since the Holocaust. There was a person by the name of Irvin Schulhoff. Schulhoff studied with Dvorak. He studied with Debussy. He was a professor of music at the Prague University until he was taken to concentration camp and was murdered in 1942. There was another composer by the name of Gideon Klein. Klein happened to be the youngest person who was murdered, who was a composer. Klein was offered a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music in London in 1940. He could not leave Germany. He was kept captive until the point he really was captive, imprisoned. He was taken to Theresienstadt. This was the camp which collected the talented, the musicians, the composers, the poets, the authors, because this was to be a model camp for the Nazis. They wanted to show what good they were doing, developing a village for Jews. And there were propaganda films made out of that. And Klein was there until he was taken, and he was murdered at the young age of 26. There was Hans Krasser. I bring up his name because in all of this terror, he was able to compose what would be happy music. So there's all kinds of music going on in the camps. Ilse Weber. Ilse Weber was a poet. She wrote poems for children. Matter of fact, when she was in Theresienstadt, she cared for children in what medical facility they had. Later, she was taken to Auschwitz and she was murdered. There was Mordechai Gebertik. Gebertik was not a musician. He was a carpenter, but he was able to write popular songs, and he composed them, but didn't have the music background to write them down, so he had the assistance of some others. But some of his songs are well-known songs today in Israel. He also, in his case, he was shot and killed in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto. Pavel Haas was a successful professional musician who wrote musical themes for movies at the time. He too was taken captive. He was at Theresienstadt. He was very, very depressed. He was encouraged by Gideon Klein and others to get back to music, and he did. He composed music until he too was murdered. Victor Ullmann was another composer considered at the time possibly to be one of the leading composers of the 20th century, also murdered in Auschwitz. When I was putting my musical program together for the Violins of Hope, the program was scheduled for a year ago, but because of COVID, it's been postponed. Hopefully one of these days we will get back and be able to perform that program. With the instruments that were recovered from the Holocaust. And I'll describe some of those instruments. But one of the pieces I picked, in addition to Schlof Mein Kind, was a piece called Send Breeder, 10 Brothers. The lyrics were composed in Sachsenhausen concentration camp by Martin Rosenberg. Martin Rosenberg was a choral director in Berlin before the war. When he was taken to the camp, and this had to be done secretly, he secretly would assemble some of the fellow Jews and they would sing. He would put on choral music but it had to be done in a secret fashion. He composed this piece called Sendbrider, and he used it to describe what he felt at the time he was in the concentration camp. And he didn't want the music to be lost. So there was another fellow in the camp who was not Jewish and eventually was able to leave. So he committed this person to memorize his words and take them out of the camp. Rosenberg was later taken to Auschwitz and was murdered. But the music, the words were taken out. They were put to music by Rosenberg to a popular theme, the Yiddish theme at the time, Yiddle mit dem Fiddle. And he had those words. I'll share just a couple of the lyrics with you so you'll know what he wanted the world to know. And he never knew that it got out to the world. And when I found this, and I was able to put it together, I had it orchestrated for the string instruments that we were going to play on. But here's how it begins. We have been 10 brothers trading with wine. One of us died, there were 9 left. Schmirl with fiddle and Tevye with bass. Play us a tune in the middle of the alley. Oi, 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 oi. Play us a tune in the middle of the alley. We have been 9 brothers trading with cargo. One of us died. There were 8 left. And then you can imagine how it goes down the line, and I'll go to the last. We've been 2 brothers trading with bones. One of us died. I was left alone. I'm still 1 brother trading with candles. I'm dying every day because I have nothing to eat. So that was what Rosenberg wanted to tell the world. And although he could not, his words did, as I'm able to share with you this evening. There were composers who survived. Many composers. They were very, very talented people who were caught up in the Holocaust. One of them actually survived a long life and ended up here in Los Angeles. His name was Herbert Zipper. And it may be a familiar name to you because in downtown Los Angeles, in the Colburn School of Music, the auditorium is named Zipper Hall. Now, Herbert Zipper was an accomplished composer, musician, conductor. He was taken, imprisoned in Dachau, and he composed while he was there the theme known as the Dachau Song. And this song and other songs in the camps were really used to keep morale in such a time of despair and depression and hunger and death. Music was what kept so many of these Jews going as long as they could. And that's the part that music played into this. I do want to share something else about what music played in the camps as well. It wasn't all positive. Music was also used by the Nazis in a couple fashions. One was what was known as music on demand. When the prisoners were marching, Nazi soldiers would go up to some of them and on demand that they sing a particular song. And if they didn't know that song, they were taken out of the line and brutalized and even killed. Or even if they sung that song but sung it softly, any excuse to do brutal, horrible things to people, this is what was on the side of the Nazis as far as music. And then music was used in another way, in the propaganda films, to show that life was considered good for the Jews in these camps. So that was the other side of music. Then there were the instruments. Surprisingly, instruments made it with their owners to the camps. Let me describe some of the instruments, if I may. You see there myself holding a violin that was recovered from the Holocaust. Very, very moving and touching to be able to have this instrument. Some of the instruments that were recovered were not fully repaired and refurbished because the violin makers, the luthiers who did this, wanted to show the world what happened to some of the instruments. The violin makers basically were two gentlemen, Amnon Weinstein and his son Avshi, who reside in Israel, were able to collect these instruments. Amnon's father was a violinist who was able to survive the Holocaust and went to Israel. And Amnon and his son have collected dozens and dozens and dozens of string instruments and have repaired violins, violas, and cellos. And this is just one that was given to me for this time, and you can see it's very touching. The members of my orchestra who were to play on the various instruments were just so moved, more than any other program we could consider. Now, let me share some of the other instruments that we also have. One is known as the Auschwitz violin, and I do have some pictures of it here. There we go. Okay, that violin was in Auschwitz. It was played in a men's orchestra in the concentration camp. The instrument survived. In this case, the violin owner also survived. Then there's another instrument called the Zimmerman violin. And this one was composed by Yaakov. It was made by Yaakov Zimmerman in Warsaw. The instrument survived. The violin maker was taken to Auschwitz and he was murdered. There's the Weininger instrument. Eric Weininger was a butcher, but he played the violin. He was taken off to Dachau, brought his violin with him, and he played that instrument. And again, this was another one of the instruments that were refurbished, and instruments that my orchestra was to perform on. Each one has its own story. Like the people, the instruments too. There's the more Purgo violin. And this one belonged to a Jewish family in Italy. And the mother wanted to give this instrument to her son to play. And she told him these words when she gave it to him. And this is before they were taken to any concentration camps. You may not become a famous violinist, but the music will help you in desperate moments of life and will widen your horizons. Do not give up. Sooner or later, it will prove me right. Well, the mother was taken to Auschwitz. The son was sent to labor camps. The instrument survived. A couple more I'm going to comment on. There's the Haftel violin. Zvi Haftel was a very fine violinist, and he played in the German orchestras. And in 1936, the word was out that German orchestras would not permit Jews to play. He and a number of other musicians who could not play in Germany were invited to go to Israel and by Bronislaw Huberman, who's the founder of the Israel Philharmonic. And Haftel went to Israel and became the concertmaster of what was then known as the Palestine Orchestra, same orchestra, now today the Israel Philharmonic. He was the concertmaster, and that was his violin. And maybe there's just one more I'll share with you. The Hackert violin, and that's an instrument that was made by Jacob Hackert, who was a Dutch violin maker. You'll notice the Jewish stars on that instrument. Violins at the time were not only performed in classical music, but many of them were used in klezmer groups. And the ones when you see with the Jewish stars were basically those that were performed in the klezmer playing. That was made by Hackert. Hackert too was taken to Auschwitz and he was murdered. With 8,000 pieces of music collected today, we're going to have a very long evening if I continue. So at this point, I think I will go back to the rabbi.
Gary, that was magnificent. I mean, I learned, I'm sure all of us learned a tremendous amount. And you're right. The music was a way Jews could manage the horrific situation in which they found themselves. And in a certain respect, it's part of the memory that lingers afterwards, part of their legacy. And I hope sometime soon, a lot of the things that were composed will begin to flood our ears with music, and we'll know that the souls of these individuals who were taken from us continue to live with their music. So thank you so much for that. So we're going to conclude now with a very special piece, familiar to all of us. But before we do that, I want to again thank you, Gary, for this wonderful presentation. It was magnificent. I've been looking at the chats as they've been coming through. I think all of us have just been totally touched and as well as illuminated by what you have shared with us. It's wonderful. And I also want to thank our dear Leah Mandelbaum for being our producer and our director and our technician. As always, thank you so much for your wonderful work in helping to put this together. We're going to conclude with the music from the film Schindler's List. As many of you know, Oskar Schindler, whose story was told in the film, saved 1,200 Jews and demonstrated that humane concern for the lives of human beings can exist in the midst of radical inhumanity. Deemed by the government of the State of Israel a righteous person among the nations, he's buried in the Catholic Franciscan Mount Zion Cemetery in Jerusalem. Now, Gary, would you please explain to us exactly who's going to be playing the music?
Sure. Of course, this is the music by John Williams, who worked with Steven Spielberg for the production of Schindler's List. You're going to hear the theme from Schindler's List. It was performed by the concertmaster of the Los Angeles Lawyers Philharmonic, performed at home, again because of COVID. His name is Michael Sue, and he's an attorney.
Beautiful. Once again, Gary, thank you. Leah, thank you. Thank you to all who handles. I think we should now say we will now all hopefully move from the darkness of Yom HaShoah to the light of Yom HaAtzmaut, from this memorial to those who have died to our living state of Israel, from hopelessness to hope. I bid you all a good evening, and may we gather again soon in a manner where we can actually be present for one another. Good evening.
Good evening. It was an honor to be here this evening.
Thank you.